All right. As we mentioned yesterday, the great spiritual movements which have in various ways, each in its own way, continued with their influence throughout Western culture, and which became really the principal, sort of metaphorically, the three rivers that watered the esoteric tradition, the alternative spiritual tradition in the West, were Neoplatonism, or the Platonism of the Alexandrian period. And present-day Platonists don't like the term Neoplatonism. So Platonism, the late Platonism, Hermeticism, and Gnosticism. And you can find evidence of the presence of the message, the content of each one of these three in the esoteric tradition, all down through the history of the West. And my province here is primarily Gnosticism, along in an auxiliary fashion with Hermeticism. As I mentioned before, Hermetics or Hermeticists and Gnostics are, I would say, if not quite siblings, then they are first cousins, or as in the homeland of my president, they might call, of our president, they might call them kissing cousins. I'm sure they've got some down south still. If not, then really it's time for the south to rise again. But so they're very close together. And as Duncan Greenlees, one of our great theosophical scholars of these matters, the author of the World Gospel series that was published in the 50s primarily, had said in his, either in his Gospel of the Gnostics or in his Gospel of the, in the Gospel of Hermes, that really the principal difference was that the Hermeticists came from a pagan background. The Gnostics came from a Jewish and Christian background, and that therefore their mythic structure was appropriate to their background, even though their message and their efforts were very, very similar. And both of these schools were primarily concerned with gnosis. They used the term gnosis, the liberating experience of gnosis. The Hermeticists appear to have been, or Hermetics, there's an argument as to which term is the more accurate. I fought with a certain editor about it terribly a while back, not an editor of Quest Publishing, but of the late and lamented Gnosis magazine. But the Hermetics or Hermeticists appear to have been more secretive than the Gnostics. And therefore, of their practices, which would be analogous to, say, the Gnostic sacraments, we have very little knowledge. So we don't know too much of what the Hermeticists did. But we know quite a bit of what they wrote, because a considerable body of Hermetic literature turned up, not just recently as with the Gnostics, but much, much earlier, in the 12th century, and according to some outstanding scholars, particularly the late Dame Frances Yates of England, the discovery or the surfacing of this Hermetic body of literature at that time, in the late Middle Ages, can be said to have been probably the principal impetus for the Renaissance. Others say that there are two kinds of Renaissance. There is the humanistic Renaissance, on the one hand, which had to do with the revival of Greek and Latin learning and artistic orientation and so forth, and poetry, and the Hermetic Renaissance, which was the spiritual side of the Renaissance. But just about everybody is agreed that the rediscovery at that time of this large body of Hermetic writings was of had a tremendous impact. And the principal early interpreter of the Hermetic writings at the time of the Renaissance was Giordano Bruno, an Italian monk who became so fired up with the Hermetic writings that he became sort of the Hermetic prophet and missionary, carried the Hermetic teachings to England, where he instigated the beginnings of the English Renaissance, which culminated in such developments as the writings of William Shakespeare, Francis Bacon, and many others. It is without doubt, to my mind, now some literary critics might disagree again, that Francis Yates's contention that Shakespeare, the Shakespearean theater is in effect a Hermetic mystery theater from beginning to end. Whether you look at the comedies or the tragedies of Shakespeare, the Hermetic element is present. Even Harold Bloom, whom I otherwise so greatly admire, who isn't quite in accord with Francis Yates on that, still says that there's incredible underlying spiritual current in Shakespeare. And of course, some of us feel that this comes from the Hermetic background. Now, okay, so you might say that there is an incredible parallel. And people who like to speculate about historical cycles and this, that, and the other thing, I don't do that so much because it's kind of a first cousin of conspiracy theories, you know. Which are fun for entertainment, but really shouldn't be taken seriously. You know, there's an incredible parallel between the surfacing of the Hermetic writings at the very beginning or just before the beginning of the Renaissance, and the Nag Hammadi library in the latter part of the 20th century. There was a tremendous revival of Hermetic learning and spirit at that time, and there is a Gnostic Renaissance of sorts going on at the present time. Now, where Theosophy falls between these two, I'll leave you to think about, let's say. But the Hermes, of course, is the son of Zeus, the Greek god. And he becomes, in Greek mythology, the principal messenger of the gods to humans, and maybe even of the gods and demigoddesses to each other. Whenever Zeus wants to send a message, Hermes, the good messenger's son, is there with his winged helmet and with the wings on his sandals and carrying his caduceus, that of course also has wings, and he flies through the air and takes the messages. There are, of course, many other mythological elements associated with Hermes, but which I can't go into. But all of these kind of concentrate around the keynote of a force or a consciousness or a being that brings together disparate factors and opposites, like the gods and the humans. He's the messenger, he's the mediator, he brings them together. For which reason comparisons have been made later on in the Middle Ages between Christ and Hermes, because he's the mediator, the savior. Now, there was also an Egyptian god by the name of Thoth. Just exactly how it is pronounced, you have to ask the ancient Egyptians. They haven't left any tape recordings or CD-ROMs behind, apparently. And so we don't really know how they pronounce things. But Thoth was the wisdom god of ancient Egypt, of pharaonic Egypt. Even as Hermes was the wisdom god of the Greeks. Now, when the Greeks, some Greeks, came to Egypt with Alexander, and Alexander's general Ptolemy took over as the new pharaoh, and his dynasty, of whom the last was the beautiful and controversial and tragic Cleopatra. There were many Cleopatras, you know, but that was the last queen of the Ptolemaic dynasty. When the Ptolemies established themselves in Egypt, the Greek and Egyptian spiritual currents began to combine. You know, that wasn't so difficult, because the Greeks, as egotistical and self-important as they tend to be then as now, I hope there are no Greeks around to hit me over the head with a double axe of Crete or whatever, you know, the Greeks recognized as a matter of course that the Egyptians were their spiritual superiors. And there are many quotations that you can bring forth from Greek sources saying that the Egyptian gods were the original form, sort of the prototypes, the models for the Greek gods as well. As they looked up to Egypt. Egypt was much older. Egypt was the hoary mystery that came from the depths of time, you know. And the Greeks recognized that, and they had a lot of respect and reverence for Egypt and its gods. And so in that period now we are talking a few hundred years BC and then few hundred years AD, this fusion of the Egyptian god Thoth. If you see representations of the Egyptian gods, he's the one who has the long pointed beak of the ibis bird. And as my late teacher and dear friend Dr. Alvin Boyd Kuhn, almost lifelong member of the Theosophical Society, used to say, you can deduce the character of the Egyptian gods from the animal forms that they wear. And if you watch the ibis bird run around in the desert, it's kind of like the Egyptian road runner. Runs around, you know, and it has that swift mercuriality, that swift mercurial movement that is attributed to Hermes. Now you got to remember, of course, that the Roman name for Hermes was Mercury. So you got these three, but here we only need to be aware of the Greek and the Egyptian form. And so, you know, what is wisdom? Wisdom is the conjoining of the divine and the human. When the human comes to the divine, when the divine comes to the human, then you have wisdom. Not just cleverness, you know, not just being smart, not just being learned, not just having access to a lot of data, but wisdom, sapientia, Sophia, Theosophy, you know. And so this was the great wisdom archetype. So now when these Hermetic schools formed in Egypt, they took Hermes as the hieratic figure, as the savior figure, as the great helper. He is the one who would guide us to wisdom, because he is wisdom embodied. And so he's the psychopomp, as John Algeo corrected me once here when I was speaking, and that I didn't, with with my bad ear, one bad ear, I didn't hear him right, and he kept saying psychopomp, and I didn't know what he was saying. In any event, the guide of souls, in this case not so much into the underworld, which was a big preoccupation of the Egyptians, of course, but into the overworld, into the world of the divine. And therefore their invocations, their prayers were addressed to Hermes. Also the Hermetic initiator, the Hermetic teacher, Hierophant, would assume the name Hermes when he was acting in his role as Hierophant. I recommend one of the lovely shorter treatises from the Nag Hammadi collection in this case, which is variously called the Treatise of the Eighth and the Ninth, or the Eighth Reveals the Ninth, as one translator called it, which is a Hermetic initiation discourse. It's my very favorite. I hope I'll be able to read or have read to me at least a goodly portion of it at my death, because to me this is like a Hermetic bardo. You know, it's just a fabulous scripture, and extremely ecstatic and euphoric in character. And there the teacher, the Hierophant, is addressed as Hermes, because he becomes the representative of Hermes to the initiate. Now, so we can say in a wider sense that what we have here is a Gnostic system of Greco-Egyptian pagan background and structure, having its own mysteries, having its own sacraments, and certainly having its own scriptures to which we have access. Some of those scriptures are the Poimandres, the Kore Kosmu, the Maiden of the World, quite a few others, and what is also often called sort of the collection of a lot of Hermetica, called the Corpus Hermeticum, the body of Hermetic writings. And some little individual pieces that turn up here and there late, like the one that I just mentioned in Nag Hammadi. And now these scriptures were available to people in our culture now since the early Renaissance, when they turned up unaccountably. Boom, here they were from the 2nd century, 3rd century or so. They turned up unaccountably all of a sudden in the Balkans. And you know, the Turks were coming at that time and pushing Constantinople and the Greeks out of their locale to remain there in Greece for about 500 years. Now, if you think something's bad, 500 years under Turkish rule, that's really bad. In Hungary, we had only had 150 years of it, but that was pretty awful in itself. So anyway, you know, all of a sudden here there were these scriptures written in Greek, and the Medici family had their agents out looking for interesting things, and they bought it, and they brought it back to Italy. And when the head of the Medici family, I can't remember now whether it was Lorenzo il Magnifico or whether it was Cosimo, saw these scriptures, he gave them to his hired translators, people like Marsilio Ficino, and said, translate these, put them ahead of everything that you are working on, even the writings of Plato. Sorry, Tony. So they put them ahead of everything and translated them, and they became really the great excitement for quite a period of time all over. And There were popes, there were cardinals who were extremely in favor of it. There was one famous cardinal at the time, I forget his name, who said that it should be required reading in all the seminaries. Yet at the same time, Giordano Bruno, who was, became the great Hermetic apostle, but who became a little bit too orthodox and too outspoken, was burnt at the stake in Rome on the Campo di Fiore, where his monument still stands, in which you can see. Incidentally, some of you may be aware, it's not important, that Dr. Annie Besant felt a particular personal kinship with Giordano Bruno, which she often mentioned. There was opposition here and there, but on the whole, the Hermetic matrix has had a tremendous impact. Now, I need to concentrate for a few minutes, and then we'll go on to the other part, on the real and imagined divergences or differences between the Judeo-Christian Gnosticism and Hermeticism. The Hermetics' one of their big myths that they applied to the human condition was the myth of Narcissus. Now you all know a little bit about dear Narcissus, who was a very good-looking young man, and instead of going to Hollywood and subsequently becoming governor or something of that sort, he looked down into a body of water and saw his image. And he fell in love with his image because he was so beautiful, and hence having a little bit too much self-esteem is often called narcissism to this day, after Narcissus. And so Narcissus falls in love with his own image and jumps, because he wants to embrace his own image, jumps down, and then he's caught. And eventually turns into a Narcissus flower, which is one of his manifestations thereafter. Now the Hermeticists said that this is the story of our spirit, of our spiritual nature. We look down from the lofty height of our original spiritual estate into the cosmos, the system, made by the demiurges that we'll hear about perhaps tomorrow. And we look and we see our own reflection, our own desire, all kinds of things there. We really perceive our own beauty. Sorry, Plotinus, when you say that this cosmos is so beautiful, it is possible that you really see the beauty of your own spirit projected onto the cosmos. Now, it's up to you. Let's put it this way, there is nothing out there that's not in here as well. Maybe Aristotle would turn it around and say that there is nothing in here that hasn't come in through the senses. But you know what? Aristotle is wrong. Now, in some past periods, one could be executed for that, I think, because Aristotle was such a sacred figure. But he no longer is. So, in any event, the Hermetic metaphor, the Hermetic symbolic story certainly indicates that when looking into the outer world and developing a desire to embrace things there, whatever they happen to be, in large measure, we are embracing a projection of some part of ourselves. And so we jump. Our consciousness jumps in extroversion into outer things, into the cosmos, and then it is caught. It can't get back. It is now in incarnation It is in the shackles of physicality, emotionality, intellectuality, and heaven knows what kind of other alities. And he says, oh dear, what has happened? And then comes the long, arduous and difficult process of somehow re-establishing conscious contact with our origins and disentangling ourselves from the cosmos. Now, it is alleged by various people, including some scholars, right to this day, that the Hermetics or the Hermeticists were optimists compared to the Gnostics. Balderdash is my verdict upon that. Because I can find you at a drop of a codex many quotations which equal in their darkness and in their consciousness of alienation in the Hermetic fold, the equivalence of such statements in the Gnostics. Except that the Hermeticists did not face one problem, which we shall look at tomorrow, and that was the problem of the imperfect creator, the Jewish God, identified by the Gnostics with the demiurge. The Greek gods had their flaws. They were mostly sort of, at least to me, endearing flaws. They like to have a good time, you know, and maybe you and I disapprove of some of those ways in which they had a good time, although I certainly have envied at times some of the exploits of dear old Zeus. And what kind of a God is it whom you can't envy? You know, really. But you know what? Jehovah, or the Lord Adonai, seemingly just never had a good time. If he did, he didn't tell anybody about it. Maybe he would have felt guilty, I don't know. But it seems that he was much more irascible, unjust, nasty, vengeful, tyrannical, and xenophobic. You know, hated all kinds of other people and urged his own people to smite them, you know. You know, what are you going to do with a God like that? It's very problematic. That's why I feel much more sorry for Jewish people than I feel for Christians, because they're settled with this God. On the other hand, if it hadn't been for that kind of a nasty God, there never would have been a Sigmund Freud, and there never would have been psychoanalysis, because it's the God image of the punitive cosmic superego that has made people so neurotic and therefore caused so many psychoanalysts to make a good living for a long time thereafter. So the Gnostics, coming from the Judeo-Christian background, had that problem. And therefore they said, yeah, the creator was a demiurge, a lower entity, and pretty much identified, at least at times, with the worst characteristics of Jehovah, of the Jewish God, who was not the father of Jesus according to the Gnostics, and so forth. There's a different category, actually, in a lesser category. And now, the Hermeticists didn't have that problem, because they were only faced with the Greek gods, and they were not such a problem. And therefore, they don't emphasize a flawed creator an archon, and the archons, these unpleasant cosmic rulers, as much, or sometimes maybe not at all, as the Gnostics do. There is the principal difference, but the difference arises out of the need to address these issues in accordance with the traditional God image of the people with whom they were dealing. Gnostics, on the one hand, dealing with the Semitic religious background, at least originally. Hermetics dealing with the Greco-Egyptian background, all right? But other than that, the principal predicament of being caught in the cosmos being a cosmic prison house, hex cellula creatoris, as Basilides is said to have called it, that prison cell of the Creator. It's very dramatic. That is certainly present in Hermeticism also. And the need to disentangle ourselves from the ways in which we have been enmeshed in an existential situation which is not of our own making. This crummy reality within which we find ourselves frequently, contrary to New Age slogans, we didn't make that reality. I didn't make that reality. I didn't make the Nazis. I didn't make the Soviet Union, by both of whom I was afflicted already as a child, and so were my relatives, and so were my people. We had nothing to do with it. We came into it. I was born into it. And I'll challenge anybody to tell me that I had anything to do with creating that lousy, miserable, nasty, evil kind of a situation, a reality. But you know what? If I didn't make it, then I don't have to feel guilty for it either. And wouldn't that be a great blessing? Wouldn't not that be a great blessing? Because if you are responsible for every kind of nastiness, then you will be weighed down by tremendous guilt. Okay, let's finish this off. The reason that a certain number of people, including scholars, are spinning the tale that the Hermetics were okay because they were optimistic and they liked the cosmos, and the Gnostics were not. The reason for that is quite singular, albeit frequently concealed, and it is this: that the Church, at that time the Roman Catholic Church, never condemned the Hermetics. They didn't condemn them because they apparently didn't even know about them until the 12th or 13th century. And therefore, it is theologically possible for an Orthodox Christian, Catholic, Eastern Orthodox and others, to embrace at least aspects of Hermeticism or Hermeticism as such, because Hermeticism was never condemned as a heresy. The Gnostics, however, were. And therefore, Gnostics are not okay, Hermetics are okay. And you will find this attitude primarily in ecclesiastically, heresiologically influenced scholars. Antoine Faivre of France, for instance, and various others. Yet, in my not so humble opinion, it is dishonest scholarship that is motivated by an unfortunate religious agenda. So Hermetics and Gnostics are very, very close together. They all recognize their captivity in the cosmos, and they all recognize the need to undo that. They need to get back in consciousness to the light from whence they have come, and that's what they both worked for, that's what they wrote about, that's what they perform their initiations about. That's what they were both about. Now, I'll stop at this point. Let me give you a little opportunity to relate yourself to these fulminations and to my lack of academic objectivity, which I have just evidenced. And then we'll go on to the hymn of the pearl. Now, yes, Tony. Oh, well, not that, that's a good question. Yes, but I got some. Here I thought some great revelatory question is going to come forth, but he's always concerned for my welfare. He's a true friend. Yes. Yeah. Okay, any Hermeticists around? Yes, Susan, yeah.
With the Hermetic myth on Narcissus, it appears to me that he's just stuck. There's no story of a return in the Hermetic?
Not to my knowledge. The way I encountered it, it just shows that he is there and he is now trying to return. The recounting of the myth goes only so far, but there is, of course, the indication that there is the possibility of a liberation. Yeah.
And you didn't mention this, but there's another Hermes, and I don't know how to say that other name, that Trismegistus?
Trismegistus, yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Where does that come in?
Yeah, well, the figure of Hermes continued to be revered, and then frequently was referred to as the thrice greatest Trismegistus, Hermes, the greatest of priests, the greatest of philosophers, and what's the third one now? It'll come to me. Anyway, they're the three kings, the greatest of kings, the three aspects. And in the earlier Middle Ages, this Hermes came to be envisioned by people. They still talked about it as a person who lived at one time, a human who was a great king, a great priest, and a great philosopher, the kind of a forerunner of Christ. And there were even discussions held about canonizing him as a saint. But at that time, there was very little known about about Hermeticism, but this was just a figure. You find it in medieval chronicles, you find this archetypal figure of the thrice greatest Hermes, yes. Mm-hmm. Good. Yes, Tony. Excuse me? Oh, there comes the more profound question.
Would you, again, liken the myth of Narcissus to the, in the sense, the immersion of materialism that no longer senses any of the transcendent?
Mm-hmm. Oh, certainly. And I would extend the concepts to saying that it is the immersion of consciousness in the world. And that would include materialism, but it would also include, say, what the Buddhists translate as the mind, the turbulent, chaotic energies of the mental cosmos. Or theosophically, it would not only be the physical, but it would be the astral and the lower mental as well, you see. Incidentally, that whole notion of a higher mental is very Hermetic, although it relates to Greek philosophy, I think, in general, and that's the nous, not the kind that goes around your neck, but Greek nous, which is that it is that kind of, it's the Hermetic mind. It's that part of our mind, of our consciousness, which is able to bridge the gap between the lower human and the higher, between the spirit. So that's a kind of the bridge or the bridge builder. Mm-hmm. Any other Hermetic Gnostic questions? Yes, sir. Yes, John. you're getting the ice cream cone there.
Could you just comment on the views that the relationship between Hermes and Moses, and the view that some claim Moses and Hermes are the same personage?
Well, I think that's a kind of scholarly cranky idea. I have not really encountered that in any serious, as a serious thesis, but you can see the archetypal similarity, what Moses is to the Jews. After all, he goes up on the mountain, the mediator, he is the one to whom God talks. And he brings down the message, just like Hermes would bring the messages from Zeus, so Moses brings down the messages from Mount Sinai. So there is certainly an archetypal similarity. Of course, you remember how that used to be explained in the 60s, that Moses went up on the mountain, and then he came back and brought these 2 tablets. And all of the children of Israel got stoned. So that's just a little pharmaceutically toned levity right there. But you can see the archetypal similarity, and then therefore, I think that this is something to actually keep in mind, because it's fairly important that really before Jung, and Mircea Eliade, who came at it from a slightly different angle, this notion of archetypes, archetypes of the collective unconscious, which are in the, let's say, in the inner worlds, in the spiritual worlds even, and which then one perceives by way of reflection and projection elsewhere, was really unknown. That doesn't mean that there were not archetypes, but people did not identify them as such. So that when you come to 19th and 18th century scholarship and so forth, when people see a similarity, they say, well, they must have been the same person. So Moses must have been Hermes, or Hermes must have been Moses, and all of this. And that is mistaking a sort of higher interior relationship for an external relationship or an external identity, There are a lot of things that are similar about Buddha and Christ. That doesn't mean they were the same person, but they played the same role, they represented the same archetype, and therefore there are similarities. And so I think we have the chance of a somewhat greater sophistication now in perceiving these spiritual realities and how they work than they had for a few hundred years. And for this, I think we ought to be thankful. It doesn't mean that you have to accept all of Jungian psychology, but I think that there are certain keys there that make the understanding of archetypal similarities in religious and spiritual figures very possible for us, and that's a very good thing.